5, 4, 3.
Good morning. Sorry we're a little bit late. We're busy this morning. I'm Nina McLemore, and you're here in our Chevy Chase store. And I want to welcome the people who are here in the store. And I think we have well over 50 or so people who are watching who could not be here. This is part of our book signing series, and I'm very pleased to have Sally Bedell Smith here. And I have to tell you, I didn't know much about George VI, and the book is not 200 pages. But I found I couldn't wait every night to get through with my busy work days and go back to the book, because there's so many wonderful stories in here, and there's so many lessons about George VI and Elizabeth and the times. So Sally, if you don't know, I think many of you do, is a historian and an author, and she's written a book on Elizabeth, on Charles, on John and Jackie Kennedy, on the Clintons, and on Bill, I forgot.
That little-known Princess Diana.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Right. I forgot that. Anyway, this is really a love story, and it's a love story between George VI, who asked Elizabeth 3 times over 2 years to marry him, and finally, after very long, she said yes, and it was quite a partnership. Anyway, so George and Queen Elizabeth stepped up to greatness with their decency, diligence, and commitment to stay in London with the girls during World War II. One sentence that really struck me was, he viewed the obligations of his high position as inseparable from its privileges. They risked their lives with repeated visits to devastated neighborhoods, often during air raids. Together, they helped build the confidence and optimism during a dangerous time, and earned widespread admiration amongst the British people and the Allies. They made the crown a symbol of British resistance and not against Nazi tyranny. So, with that, I'm going to start my questions so that you can hear from Sally. So I was actually, as I said, a little surprised about how little I knew about George VI and what he accomplished. And, I think we kind of go, I'm from Mississippi, so I say Mississippi history went from Victoria to Elizabeth. So it sort of skipped over the Georges and the Edwards. But they brought morale and endurance brought that to the fore in England during the war. So I wanted to ask you, you've studied the royal family quite a bit.
Yes.
And why did you choose, I think I know the answer, but why did you choose to write about George VI, and why did you wait so long?
Well, I had other books to write along the way. I think the origin really came, although I may not have known it at the time, but I think I did, with my biography of Elizabeth II. And I was so struck by how, when she was 25 years old, she just automatically filled her role. And I interviewed, at one point, Winston Churchill's youngest daughter, Mary Soames, who was fascinating on it. And she said her father told her that Elizabeth at 25 was attentive to everything. She always was incredibly conscientious, and that she knew exactly what she was doing from day one. She was receiving ambassadors, she was receiving dignitaries from all over the world, and she was, and others said that she just was so conscientious. She knew the Constitution inside and out. And I said to myself, how did this come to be? One factor, obviously, was her inherent intelligence, but also it came from her mother and father. And so I tucked that away and thought I would like to know more about this couple who shaped a woman who would reign for 70 years and would really lift the crown to much greater heights. So that was kind of the original, the nub of it, and it was interesting when she took the throne. She wrote to one of her friends. This is Queen Elizabeth II. She said, "The curious thing is I've lost my timidity. I am completely ready for this." And Churchill was struck by her confidence. And when I was doing the research for this book, I came across a letter that her mother had written to some friends saying, yes, we were sort of stunned by this sudden responsibility thrust upon us. But she said almost the same word. She said, "The curious thing is we're not afraid."
So that speaks a lot to the parents and to Elizabeth. So George VI and Elizabeth is very much of a love story. They were very supportive of one another. They really liked being together. They worked very well together. I mean, it was a real partnership. So how did the two of them meet, and what was their marriage like? What does that tell you about his personality?
Well, they met on July 8th, 1920, at a Royal Air Force ball at the Ritz Hotel in London. He had a newly hired equerry named James Stuart, who was the second son from a very aristocratic Scottish family, who had, unbeknownst to then Duke of York, we'll call him Bertie today because that's how everybody knew him. Unbeknownst to Bertie, Elizabeth had been having a romance with James Stuart for a whole year, but he saw her dancing with James Stuart on the dance floor, and he went over to him afterwards and he said, "I would like to meet that woman that you were just dancing with." And so Bertie danced with Elizabeth for the first time, and he fell head over heels in love. And he also fell in love with her family. He began inviting himself to their family estate in Scotland, Glamis Castle, and writing her letters. And I mean, one of the things that helped to make this book, I think, so authentic and intimate is that Queen Elizabeth II gave me access to her family's papers in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. And I went there every day for 3 months and read their diaries and letters. And through that, I could see the evolution of this romance. They were both very restrained initially in their correspondence, but he was determined. You asked what this said about him. He was absolutely determined that she was the one, and she was polite and kind, and she did call him her most faithful friend in one of her letters. But she turned him down first in early 1921, and then again in early 1922. And they continued to see each other at dances in London and country house parties. But the interesting thing is she never shut the door. She always kept it open for him. And finally, this was really, really fascinating to me. When I was in the Royal Archives, I discovered that she began a diary on the 1st of January, 1923, which was 2 days before his third proposal. So she clearly knew that her life was about to change. And the first chapter of the book is a chronicle of the moment he proposed to her while dancing with her, dancing again at Claridge's, and it took her 12 days to say yes. And I go through all of the ups and downs and the worries and her running around everywhere. And finally, right before midnight on the 14th of January, she said yes. And she never really explained why she took so long. It was 30 months, which showed just how determined he was. He almost gave up, but Queen Mary was behind the scenes. I should say one thing that Queen Mary engineered, which was very clever, which she had a friend of hers who went to James Stewart and said, I have a, because the second born would never inherit anything. And so this person said to him, I can offer you a very lucrative job in the United States. And so off he went in early 1922. And then Bertie was free to pursue her.
Well, it's interesting that my sense was that part of it was that she wasn't sure she wanted to be in such a structured environment as the royal family, because she'd grown up in Scotland. Her personality was anyway. I'll let Sally talk about her personality, but I had a discussion with my sister-in-law who's British about it, and I didn't realize. I didn't go back far enough, but it seems to me there were no queens or consorts in Britain who were English for at least 200 years. They were all German.
Yeah.
So she was the first British queen. So I wondered, can you tell us about her personality and whether that played into her popularity?
I think it absolutely did. I mean, and the one reason why a British monarch or a British member of the royal family was allowed to marry a non-European royal was George V that actually made he had made a proclamation in 1917 saying they were free to marry English aristocrats. So that, gave an opening. But I think, yes, the royal family was in itself very Germanic. Queen Mary, her father was, he was a German aristocrat, and she even spoke with a sort of slight German accent. So I think it was very important, in a sense, for the British royal family to have an infusion of pure Britain. She was a Scot, and I think that was very important. She was the daughter of the 14th Lord Strathmore, a long and revered member of the aristocracy. They had a fantastic castle in Scotland called Glamis. They had a beautiful estate in England, St. Paul's, Walden Bury. She came from a family of 9 children. It was a sort of rollicking family, very informal. They had, there was a huge age range. She was the second youngest, and her mother was also quite unusual for a woman of her class. She was very affectionate and very maternal. And so those children were all brought up with a lot of love and physical contact and a lot of fun. I mean, Elizabeth had a great sense of humor. A lot of it came out in her letters. At one point when she was writing to Bertie, after they'd become engaged, before the wedding, she said she called him her little pink angel, and she asked if he would call her his honey lamb. And so there was a lot of that kind of irreverent banter. And he, as Nina pointed out, had grown up in a very structured environment, and all was overshadowed by his spoiled but incredibly charming older brother, Prince Edward, known as David in the family, who was the future King Edward VIII. And he also had, a crippling stutter, which didn't allow him to mix it up with the members of his family. He was often very quiet. And then, but he got to the Strathmores, and they played games, they danced reels, they went out, obviously, and shot together, and played tennis. And it was just lots of practical jokes. It was just a totally different kind of family. So he fell in love first with her, and he knew her brothers a little bit. But then he fell in love with the entire family, who embraced him and gave him a completely different perspective.
I think one of the telling things was on her wedding day at Westminster Abbey, as she was walking in,
Yes.
she took a flower as she passed by the unknown soldier memorial. She took a flower out of her bouquet.
It was actually her entire bouquet.
Oh, really? Oh, sorry.
Yes, she put her entire bouquet. It was, and she never explained why she did it, but she did have a flair for the dramatic. She would really captivate people. She had a way of looking at people. She had a wonderful smile. She showed her affection at people, and this was a moment that nobody expected. She was walking in with her father, and she walked forward a few steps, and she put it down. Now, she had lost one brother in the Battle of Loos in World War I. Her 3 other brothers also suffered shell shock and were injured. One had been a POW. One never recovered from what we now call PTSD. So this was, in all likelihood, in her mind. And she took her bouquet and she laid it on the tomb of the unknown, and then she and her father went down through the nave. And every single royal bride who has been married in Westminster Abbey has done the same thing. And Camilla, at the coronation, put her bouquet on the tomb of the unknown.
So, what were some of the adversities that you've referred to his speech, but that Bertie and Elizabeth had to overcome? He was shy.
Yes.
He had a stutter, and yet he was a key voice during World War II. I'm going to ask you, how accurate was the movie The King's Speech? I'm sure you all saw that.
Well, I think of all the movies that have been made about the royal family, The King's Speech, first of all, was the most accurate. Obviously, they took dramatic license and compressed some things, but in the essence of capturing the relationship between Bertie and his speech therapist, Lionel Logue, it was very active. It was very accurate. And also in capturing the dynamic between Bertie and Elizabeth, it was very accurate. And after it won multiple Academy Awards, and the report came back to the Queen Elizabeth II, that people were giving standing ovations at the end of the movie. Her cousin, she had a wonderful cousin named Margaret Rhodes, who I became very good friends with, and she went to the Queen and she said, "Ma'am, you really must see this movie." And so they had a private screening for her, and she was sort of typically non-committal, but she said, "Yes, well, it was all right," and that was high praise from her. But she's never seen The Crown. She never saw The Crown. She never saw The Queen, the movie starring Helen Mirren. She never saw anything else. And it was funny because when in 1992, which turned out to be what she called the annus horribilis, when everything that could go wrong did go wrong, there was a documentary. That was her Ruby Jubilee year, which people tend to forget, but they did do a documentary. And at one point, this kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed new press secretary came in and said, "Ma'am, we have a rough cut of this documentary. Would you like to see it?" And she said, "I don't think so. I see enough of myself every day." And she had that attitude. She didn't really want to see how she was depicted on screen. She didn't particularly want to read books or articles or anything about her. She was very self-contained.
That's amazing. So, what I was fascinated. She goes into a tremendous amount of detail. I mean, if you really want to know, what the royals lived like and what was the daily life like. So, I wanted to know, like, what was it really like being a royal at the time?
Yes.
And what were their relationships with the people, and how were they educated?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but it was particularly when George V and Queen Mary were reigning, which was until January 1936. It was a very regimented life. They went from Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle to Balmoral, for shooting, and then they went to Sandringham in Norfolk at Christmas, and everybody had to do everything on time. And Elizabeth, it was interesting because Elizabeth became sort of the epitome of duty and humble service as time went on. But she sort of bristled a bit at the beginning and would say, to Bertie, or Bertie said to his mother, I think Lilibet is bored at Balmoral, with good reason, because there were all these antique people. And she didn't really have anybody to be with, and Queen Mary kept everybody busy going on expeditions. But getting back to your question of education, she had a very particular kind of education.
And we're talking about Elizabeth, the Queen.
We're talking about Elizabeth the Queen. And this was something I wanted to learn from writing this book, which was part of how they trained her. It was fascinating to me. I found out this actually from Queen Mary's diaries. I read in the archives, I read the diaries of King George V, Queen Mary, Elizabeth, and Bertie, and lots of their letters. Queen Mary and George V's diaries were incredibly dull, but it was a roadmap to what everybody was doing at any given time, so it was very helpful. And I took note that when Lilibet was 4 years old, now put in your mind Prince Louis and think about him doing this. When she was 4 years old, Queen Mary had a party for the wives of Indian princes, and she invited Lilibet to come, and she behaved beautifully. She went out with her mother on engagements at a very early age, and one of the reasons is that George V began to twig to the fact in the late 20s that his eldest son, Edward, did not have the makings of a good king. He wasn't sure quite what to do about it, but he knew that he knew that little Lilibet, who was his favorite grandchild, would someday be queen, and he wanted to expose her to situations. And so, for example, this was actually when George VI was king. In the months before World War II, the foreign minister of Poland came to Buckingham Palace for a luncheon. Now, Poland was the reason why, when Hitler invaded Poland, that triggered World War II. And so the Polish ambassador was there to sign the treaty that ultimately bound Britain to take that act. A dozen grown-ups at the luncheon table and 12-year-old Lilibet.
Wow.
So, so that was part of her training. She was also, when she was 13, her mother hired a fascinating guy named Henry Martin, who taught her constitutional history. He was a provost at Eton, the boys' school, down the road. And he taught her, and she was an incredibly diligent student. I mean, that was another thing that Churchill discovered when she became queen, is how much she knew about the Constitution. So she had, as I said, it was a particular education, but she was very well read. And Queen Mary took a very strong hand in the kinds of subjects she was taught and in the book she read, she had to learn how to memorize a lot of poems. She had to learn history. As her governess, Marion Crawford, said, she was soaked in history. When Joe Kennedy and Rose Kennedy, when he became the ambassador in 1938 to the Court of St. James, they went to Windsor Castle for the weekend, and he was seated next to Lilibet. And he was asking her about her schooling, and she said, well, we're studying geography, and in fact, I've just been studying all about the East Coast of the United States. So she was savvy, too. I mean, that was obviously an answer that greatly pleased the American ambassador. And so she, those were all the ways, and you can't underestimate what they did in the way of modeling and by example. The horrible test for every Briton began in August 1940 with the beginning of the Blitz.
So can we divert back to Edward VIII?
Edward VIII,
and why he was not fit to be king.
Let me count the ways. He was...
And how did they get rid of him?
He was spoiled. Well, this is fascinating. He was spoiled. He was cynical. He was inattentive to his duties. He was so unreliable that when he was king, he was only king for 362 days, from January 1936 to December 1936. And he was a really bad king. I mean, bad beyond, when I read about him in letters that went back and forth, not only within the royal family, but with, for example, the Governor General of Canada, who was in touch with him all the time, he just flouted his duties. And they were really worried about it. But there was really nothing they could do. But he just had a deeply flawed character. And so when he had had a series of romances with married women. He liked to be with married women. He liked to be dominated, which he wrote in his letters, actually. And Wallace came along, and she gave him everything he wanted, I guess, including being a dominating personality. And his absolute determination to marry her and make her his queen is what really ended it for him, because that went against not only the rules of the Anglican Church, but also the rules of the government. And the only solution was for him to abdicate, which he did on December 10th, actually. It was ratified on the 11th, 1936.
So,
and by the way, there are a lot of people I talk to in England who say, we really should have a statue somewhere of Wallace Simpson, because we're not quite sure how we would have gotten rid of him if she hadn't come along. Twice divorced, which was a no-no.
So, did Bertie want to be king? Did he have that ambition to be king? How did he respond?
Well, he didn't have that ambition to be king. He was the Duke of York. She was the Duchess of York. They had two lovely daughters. They did their duty. One of Lilibet's friends talked about their relationship, and they were she said they were four people who formed a sort of united, a spiritual whole. W-H-O-L-E. And they didn't seem to need anybody else, either friends or relatives, that they were very self-contained. He was a spare, right? Nobody used that word then. But he found, the thing that really struck me is that he found meaning as a spare. And he did a lot of work with something called the Industrial Welfare Society. and he made it his mission to make the lives of workers, factory workers, miners, to improve them and to increase the communication between the owners, the businessmen, and the workers. And he did a lot of projects, building gyms, helping with their medical care, helping with their pensions, helping with their overtime. And he was very proud of it. They called him the Industrial Prince. So he had a surprisingly democratic, small d, streak and a real touch with the common man. He had a camp every summer for boys from very posh boarding schools who went to camp with boys from factories and mines. And they all dressed alike, and they all competed in games that were never played in boarding schools. And he loved doing that. So he was being prepared in ways that probably people didn't recognize. And when the role of king was thrust upon him in this, by the abdication, he was thrown for a loop, as was she. He wrote an account of those days leading up to his brother's departure. And he wrote at one point, he said, when he learned of his fate, he said, I put my head on my mother's shoulder and I cried like a baby. But once it became his destiny, he embraced it, as did she. And as I mentioned earlier, she said it was sort of like a blow to the head. But in letters she wrote, she said, the curious thing is we are not afraid.
Mm. So, determining what people's or government's intention is, and those who are able to somehow see that intention is a fascinating topic. And now we have this British royal family who's German, mm-hmm. and
primarily.
We have, the quote-unquote appeasement. We have the legacy of World War I. And what was the mood in terms of thinking that Hitler was going to prompt a war versus not? And how did George VI, what did he think before the war, before Hitler invaded Poland, and what did he think after? I mean, how did he make?
Yeah, well, I think like nearly everybody who had been through World War I, although he had been ill during most of the war with a terrible undiagnosed gastrointestinal problem, he had served in one battle, the Battle of Jutland, and he had won a commendation. He was in a gun turret, and he fired a lot, and he saw a lot of people dying. And his brother was sent to France, but he was sent way behind the line, so he never saw any action. And it was always something that Bertie thought, well, I did that and you didn't. But still, the many, many losses and the devastation caused by World War I understandably made the royal family and many, many others in England very wary of the idea of getting into war. Now, Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden, there was a whole group of leaders and people out of government, Churchill was out of government at the time, knew what Hitler was up to. They knew he was rearming, they knew he was preparing for bombing, they knew that he wanted to invade Britain, they knew all that, but I think many people, including for a while, the British royal family sort of put blinders on. And they thought, well, Elizabeth even read Mein Kampf when they were on their way to the United States in May of 1939 for a really historic visit. It solidified, it created the the special relationship. But they still couldn't believe that Hitler would really do this. I mean, there was the really pivotal moment occurred in the autumn of 1938 when Chamberlain was prime minister, and he flew on an airplane for the first time and went to Germany to meet with Hitler because Hitler wanted half. He said, that's all I want. I only want half of Czechoslovakia because I think it belongs to us. And Chamberlain made multiple trips over there to try and appease him. And he got a document from, several documents from Hitler saying, oh, no, this is all we want. Don't worry. We won't bother anybody else. And Chamberlain took it at face value, and so did the king and queen. He came back. And another interesting thing, when all this was happening, Elizabeth was up in Scotland at their place at Balmoral, and Bertie was in London trying to figure out if there was any way he could help. And it was the first glimpse to me of how tight their partnership was and how much he confided in her, which was really unusual. He was sending papers up to Balmoral for her to read and comment on and then send back to him about Chamberlain and Hitler. So, the long and the short of it is they just didn't want Britain to go through this again. But as it became more and more apparent that Hitler had very ambitious designs on all of Europe, they started increasing production, and then, of course, in March of 1939, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia and said, I'm going to take Poland. And that's when the British government drew a line in the sand and said, if you take Poland, we will declare war.
So in June of 1939, between Czechoslovakia and
Yes.
Poland, right?
Yeah.
They made a 7-week trip to Canada, went, from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back again, and then came down to Washington and Hyde Park.
Hyde Park. Yeah.
For 4 days. For 4 days, and that created an unusual bond between Elizabeth and George and Eleanor and FDR. So what can you tell us about that? And is there some similarity between the handicaps that both of them had,
Yeah.
or were there? What was?
I mean, I think the handicaps did play into it. Bertie, as we've talked about, had a stutter that he never fully mastered, but with his speech therapist, he managed to sort of deal with it. And of course, Roosevelt had polio. He didn't have the use of his legs. So I think there was a kind of a mutual empathy there. But they really had a meeting of minds on what could be done, even though, George VI was very mindful of the isolationist sentiment in the United States, and that Roosevelt, although he wanted to help, was up against a lot of opposition. But they had a series of conversations beginning in the White House. It was a ferociously hot 4 days or 3 days when they were there, 2 days actually. At one point, Queen Elizabeth lay down on the floor of the Lincoln bedroom to try and cool off. But they were greeted. It was the first time a British monarch, much less any monarch, had ever visited the United States. There were 700,000 people on the streets of Washington. And even Eleanor Roosevelt, who had seen a lot, said, I've never seen a reception like this. And there was a moment when they arrived at Union Station, and a band played the British national anthem and then the American national anthem, and I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. But there were tears in Elizabeth's eyes when she heard the American national anthem. And they had a punishing schedule. They put a wreath on George Washington's grave at Mount Vernon. They went everywhere, and they were really well prepared. That was the other thing that the Roosevelts and everybody else took note of. They had these big briefing books, and they knew everything about all the WBA. They knew everything, and they asked really good questions. And so the Roosevelts were sort of, whoa, they may be young, but they know what they're doing. And and Roosevelt and George VI started having conversations in Washington that they continued after the royal couple had been in New York, and it was another wild day of millions of people, and they made it to Hyde Park, and then the two leaders had two more conversations, and they settled on the outlines of two deals that would really, really help Britain in the early days of the war. The Lend-Lease program that wasn't passed for a few more, well, actually it wasn't passed until 1941, and the destroyers for bases. And this enabled, because Dunkirk happened in May of 1940, and they lost everything. They lost all their equipment. They had to leave it behind. So the United States sent a lot of vital equipment, including battleships, and also later under the Lend-Lease program. So Roosevelt knew he had to bring the American people around, but in the meantime, he was doing everything, as he said, everything short of declaring war, which he finally did in December of 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So that bond between George VI and the Roosevelts was really essential, and it helped hasten the arrival of Churchill on, for the Atlantic Charter. And then Roosevelt and Churchill developed an extremely close bond.
So I'm going to come back to what they did during the war, but I want to go back to Glamis.
Oh, Glamis, yes.
The home of Elizabeth. What happened there during World War I?
During World War I, this was a formative experience for Elizabeth. Glamis is a vast castle, and her mother, Lady Strathmore, turned it into a convalescent home, and so something like 1,500 soldiers came through, and many were really severely wounded. I mean, wounds you wouldn't want to see, and a lot of them had PTSD. And there was a nurse there, and there was Elizabeth's mother, and there was Elizabeth, who was sort of 16 years old. And she just took care of these men in a non-professional way, but she was empathetic to them. And I think, that experience of dealing with kind of ordinary guys, there weren't very many officers there, helped develop her, her sense of compassion. And you can draw a bright line from there to the way she handled herself during World War II.
So between that experience and Bertie's experience in the Industrial Workers and the Prince's Boys Club,
right.
How did that play into, and what actually did they do during the war that it gave the British people such confidence and such love for them?
Well, initially, there was the Phony War, which went from September of 1939 till really the spring of 1940, when the Nazis began to move on other European countries. And in those early times, they visited troops and, just tried to, buck up the result, because they were, until Dunkirk, they were over in Europe, and they were planning on, waging war with Germany's troops, because they were at war. And then really beginning with the Blitz, when the devastation in London was staggering, and also all throughout Britain. And so they really dedicated themselves, often at great risk, of going out into the neighborhoods after they were bombed, consoling the people, just sort of bearing witness to the destruction. They made inspirational speeches to all over, Europe and all over the world, really. And the really key thing was that Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times. And although they did, at the Home Office in September of 1940 said to the King and Queen, "You cannot stay overnight here anymore because things are going to happen." And literally 2 days after they moved to Windsor to stay there overnight, while still coming into London every day and or out in the countryside, there was the first bomb that exploded under his study that would have killed him, probably, had he been there. And then that was also the first day that they had their weekly lunch with Churchill. And many of those lunches took place in the bomb shelter. And she joined them many times, which was also highly unusual because Churchill really trusted her discretion. But so the first bombing was on the 10th of September, and then Friday the 13th, they were back in Buckingham Palace, and they were in sort of a new area of the palace that had been prepared for them to use. And a bomber came down the Mall and dropped bombs right in front of them, right in the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace. And they both wrote accounts of it that are really chilling. They somehow managed to get into a hallway, but they were nearly killed. And it wasn't until after the war, when Churchill was writing his memoirs, that they finally told him what happened. And he said that if the windows had been closed instead of open, as they were that day, all of the glass would have shattered on the two of them and would have either severely disfigured them or killed them. And they knew what a close call they had. The British people knew it had been bombed, but you know what they did right after that? They went into the East End and they bore witness to what had happened to them as well, and they knew that the King and Queen were not immune to what they were experiencing. And so it forged a really tight bond. Right after that bombing, George VI issued a public statement and said, "We have now been exposed to German barbarity, and this makes us all the more resolute to fight to a final victory." And that was the sort of thing that they said all the time. Obviously, Churchill gave amazing speeches as well, but they were there to increase morale and to just praise people for being so brave while setting an example of bravery. I mean, she said at one point, they were in the basements of so many police stations when the bombs were falling. They were herded in, and then they would drink tea and get the all clear, and then they'd go out again. So it was dangerous. They had armored cars. One of them was called the Brontosaurus. And they had an armored train that they used to park in the underpasses when they went out. But he traveled over 50,000 miles during World War II, and she was with him most of the time. In Coventry, there was an 11-hour assault on Coventry, 500 German planes, and it was absolutely flattened. And George VI went there, and he spent 5 hours, just talking to the victims.
So what impact did that have on the people? How did they respond?
Well, I mean, there were some. This is the only book. This is my 8th biography, and it's the only one that periodically would bring me to tears. They would go out, and whether it was in the most impoverished sections of the city or around the country, people sang to them, they cheered them, and they just so appreciated that they were putting their lives on the line on their behalf.
So there was one scene, I don't remember where or when it was, but there was one scene where they went out into the people. I don't know whether it was a bunch of soldiers and basically one of the soldiers said, "If Hitler could see,
Yeah,
if Hitler could see this now."
That was actually in Canada. I mean, the one thing that was
that's right.
that I mean, they had no hesitation about going down and mingling with the people and talking to them. They were never sort of removed from them. And during their visit to Canada before they came to the United States, they were dedicating a war memorial to soldiers in World War I. And there was a huge crowd of veterans. And she said to the Governor General of Canada, Lord Tweedsmuir, we must go down and talk to them. And he said, really? We don't have any security. And we have enough security. We have them. And they went down in the middle, and there they were, and they were talking to all of them. And one of them shouted out, "Aye, ma'am, if Hitler could only see you now," you know. And he did, Hitler did call her the most dangerous woman in Europe.
So were you surprised by the amount of information that George VI read and the amount of involvement he had in the military maybe not decisions, but how up to date he was on what they were doing?
Yes, I think like a lot of people, and I even expressed this in the book that I wrote about the Queen, I think I underestimated his intelligence. And it was only because the Queen gave me access to her father's diaries and their letters and the diaries of everybody in the family and letters of everybody in the family. But the diary that he kept from the first day of the war on September 3rd, 1939, till the beginning of 1947, was the real revelation in this book, because it showed how conscientious he was and how knowledgeable he was about military actions. And although he didn't mention it, he knew every secret. He knew all about the Enigma codes. He knew all about the development of the atomic bomb. He knew everything. He shared it with her, which she admitted later in life simply by saying, "He told me everything," without specifying. But clearly she knew all about that. And because he really made it his business to know what all the strategies were and to meet with everybody who was involved, whether it was military men, politicians, members of the Home Guard. Everybody was in this war because everybody was being attacked. And so the civilian part of it was very important. And he created something called the George Cross, which commended civilians who had exhibited bravery. The Victoria Cross was designated for members of the military who had been brave in battle. So he recognized the importance of regular civilians who were manning the anti-tank guns and, doing all sorts of work as firefighters, helping to save St. Paul's Cathedral. There were a lot of just regular people on those bucket brigades. And people realized that. They knew that he appreciated what they were doing. And that was hugely important.
We know Rosie the Riveter, here in the U.S., but I was surprised by how often you mentioned the role that women played in making armament.
Yeah, they went to visit factories that were completely making armaments. There's a picture in the book of them looking at shells. And yes, and she in particular, she gave some wonderful speeches during the war, praising the women. Not only the women who were working in the factories and women who were driving ambulances on the front lines, but also the women who were kind of keeping the households together, which was very important while the men were away. And I think that really, really helped. I mean, they really inspired the British people. And, you know, in his Christmas message, which he gave every year on the radio, and she always helped him to write. It was all about, you know, staying the course. We're going to win. I mean, she was she was an enormously optimistic person, and very strong. Cecil Beaton once said she was like a marshmallow made on a welding machine. So she had a very sort of sunny, you know, jolly exterior, but when things got tough, she knew what to do.
So I want to talk about his relationship with Churchill and the respect that Churchill had for him, et cetera. But I think you said that on D-Day,
yes,
that they both Churchill and George VI wanted to go be in the flotilla on D-Day, but the general said, you cannot do this,
no,
right?
exactly. I mean, they both agreed, wouldn't it be great if we went out, you know, with this invasion force, and we were on one of the battleships. And I mean, when the generals and the admirals in charge heard about this, they said, they went to his private secretary and Tommy Lascelles, and they said, no, this is a very bad idea. And so he actually persuaded the king that this would not be a good idea. But it took some effort, and there was a lot of tension between Churchill and the king wrote him several letters, and he said, okay, imagine my daughter. If we both go down, imagine her being the new queen at the age she was then and having to appoint a prime minister. And then I think that sort of got to Churchill. But George VI was prepared to drive to Portsmouth and literally stand there and prevent Churchill from getting on a ship.
So I think this is a very important book to read, and I think that that his character and his ability to stand up for what was right,
Yeah,
and be prepared, and their ability to lead the people is something that, in a genuine way, is something that I think we could learn from.
I absolutely believe that. I mean, they really rose to greatness. They endured lots of hardships. Yes, they lived in Windsor Castle. Yes, they lived in Buckingham Palace. And yes, they were able to escape a few times to Balmoral and Norfolk. But you know, they went through it with everybody. I mean, they had boarded up windows. They ate terrible food, just like everybody else. And I think that was hugely important, you know, that they did have a deep bond with the British people who knew that they were in the same boat.
So, what questions do we have from the audience? We usually hand out cards, but I didn't do that today. Yes.
Well, thank you so much. This is really insightful and compelling.
Thank you.
But you said earlier on about Elizabeth growing up in a large, open family. It sounded to me a lot like how Kennedy grew up. Do you think there are any similarities in those backgrounds that help them be so engaging and so much a part of the people?
Yeah, you know, I hadn't really thought of that, but I mean, I think there is something to be said about a big family. I mean, she said it was just so wonderful to be loved by, you know, by so many siblings and a mother. I mean, she had a very quirky father, but they all loved him. You know, he used to bowl oranges down the dinner table, and Lady Strathmore used to catch them. He was a real avid cricketer, and he was always playing cricket in the halls of Glamis. But I think the Kennedys were different because they were a very, very political family, and they had political destiny in the forefront for one or the other of the brothers. and and Joe Kennedy was a real martinet. And I think the Strathmore family was very different from them. But she certainly, from growing up in a family of 9, she learned how to get along and with people with different personalities. And as I said before, she saw real tragedy. I mean, losing 2 brothers by the time she was 15, one to a tumor and one in battle. I have, incredibly poignant letter that her governess wrote to her mother about what happened when Elizabeth heard the news. I mean, it was devastating, as you can imagine, because she loved her brother, obviously. And then to see her 3 other brothers shattered in one way or another, and her eldest brother, who was the heir, just never recovered. So the Kennedys had tragedies, but later on. I mean, they did have them during the war. They lost Joe, and had one mentally deficient child. So,
Other questions?
Yeah.
During the war, George and Elizabeth are doing all these wonderful things. You hear about, who knows, that Edward was running around sort of making mischief.
Oh.
Sort of their relationship during the war.
Yeah, well, it was pretty frosty. The abdication was exceedingly difficult, and they'd had a pretty good relationship before then. But in the abdication, they learned that he lied to them about some fairly significant things, like the £1 million that he had squirreled away, that in today's dollars would be 100 million. And he went to George and said he pleaded poverty. He said, I only have 90,000, which would be 900,000, which is not bad. And he kind of blackmailed, in a way, his brother into paying him an allowance. They were over in France, and this was in 1940, when they were staying in Madrid, and they were definitely consorting with German agents, and there were discussions some of which were learned about at the time, but more was learned after the war when they captured some files. But he was ready on a signal. He had a code. When he was sent by Churchill to be the Governor General of the Bahamas to get him out of the way. A wartime expediency, he called it. But before he left, he was in communication with some Germans who gave him a code that would indicate they had invaded England and they would install him as king, and Wallis would at last be his queen. But in looking over the diaries of George VI, I think I counted up something like 50 entries were devoted to him, and just what a pain in the neck he was. I mean, he just was sort of making all these demands. And it was a tragedy for Queen Mary, because she had lost one son when he was 13 who died in an epileptic fit. And then, then she basically lost her eldest son, who was disaffected from the royal family. And then during the war, she lost probably her favorite son, Prince George, who was killed in 1942 in a plane crash. So she had a lot of sorrow in her life. That was a little bit of a veer, but she comes through as a very demanding, very imperious character in this book. But I also felt very sympathetic toward her. And she and Elizabeth, while having a sort of frosty relationship at the beginning, really developed a wonderful mother-in-law, daughter-in-law rapport.
Any other questions? Okay, we thank Sally for writing the book and for being here today. And we have books, of course, for sale. And
Thank you, Nina. And thank you for being here. Thank you. They're wonderful questions.
You're welcome. Okay.
Thank you. Did they have wonderful handwritings in their diaries?
He had pretty good handwriting. He had very sort of sturdy, almost schoolboy handwriting.
Copper plate kind of.
Yeah, not even copper plate. It wasn't as good as that. One of the things George V said to the governess for Lilibet and Margaret was, please teach them good handwriting. Because he didn't have very good handwriting. Queen Mary's was pretty good. It was fun.
That's a challenge reading diaries.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of
I
diary.
mean, I got a lot of help from
Thank you so much.
I'm going to send you.